It's a great honor to be here with you, and I got to tell you, for me, it's very invigorating to see such a motivated, bright group of youngsters that are ready to take up the torch of freedom and liberty and go out and evangelize those ideas and values. Listening to the great doctor that spoke earlier, I said to somebody, this is like trying to get a drink from Liberty's fire hose. It was amazing listening to that speech. A little bit about me, other than that bio that you heard. I cut my teeth and built my first business in the former Soviet Union. My first trip to Moscow was in January of 1988. It was still the Soviet Union back then. And I went there out of a sense of curiosity. I come from a traditional Irish Catholic family, and one of the things my grandmother used to make us do was pray the rosary. And you'd be trying to hide somewhere or go out into the field or something, and she'd call you back and make you do it. And one decade of the rosary was always for the conversion of Russia, which may sound strange to you that are not Catholic, and it seemed strange to me too at that time. But that left a deep impression, and I thought, wow, these guys must be really bad. And so I had this sense of curiosity and wanted to go to Russia and see what this was all about. And when I went there in January of '88 and I saw that the lines outside the stores for goods that were not available or in very limited supply, saw the cars that looked like they belonged in the early 1950s, saw the state of the roads and of the infrastructure, I realized that this was a giant Potemkin village, that Marxism, that socialism, that communism was a fraud, and that its greatest victims were its own people. And that left a very, very deep impression on me as a young fellow about the age that some of you are here now. And it's too long a story to tell, but on one side of a particular deal that I was doing were a number of young Latvians who were members of the Latvian Popular Front, which was their independence movement. And I got involved with them on the fringes, helping with posters and pamphlets and that sort of thing. And lo and behold, in 1991, when the coup took place against Gorbachev, they declared independence. Now, I thought that they'd end up like sort of the Irish heroes of 1916 being put up against a wall and being shot, and they weren't. They became, in a political sense, the proverbial dog that caught the bus. They declared independence, and everybody went, okay. And they ended up with a country, once again free, and having to build it from scratch and take themselves out from under the yoke of communism and collectivism. And that was a tough journey for them. And I was there, and I witnessed it, and it formed me in my understanding of the threats to freedom and the threats to enterprise and what it takes to build businesses and enterprise coming out of a disaster like that. The disaster of communism for all of those decades, the disaster of communism that took over 100 million lives across this world. And what is stunning to me is that still today, there is not an understanding of what a profound evil that system wrought across this globe. There is an understanding, thank God, of what Nazism, National Socialism did, but the other side of the same coin is communism, and there hasn't been an understanding. And the previous speaker talked about the march through the institutions. One of the institutions that has been or is being marched through is the institution of business, of commerce, because business and commerce is what produces innovation, ideas, prosperity. It's what lifts millions, billions from poverty. It is a miracle when you look at the history of the last 100 years or so and see the number of people, nations, peoples lifted from being dirt poor to being able to get access to services, goods, jobs, income, and dignity. And all of those things are dangerous to the enemies of freedom because they need dependence. They need people to need them. They do not want free peoples. They do not want people to be able to prosper. And what has happened is the free market, while it has been allowed to be free, to the degree that it has been allowed to be free, has delivered for people that were poor and is lifting them and raising them from poverty. And the statistics all prove that fact. So what's going on? I'm going to say something to you that many of you won't have heard before, but there is a very insidious threat inside, or what seems like inside the ranks of business, and it is perhaps the most profound threat to economic liberty, to economic freedom, to enterprise, to entrepreneurship. And that enemy is what I call crony corporatism. Crony corporatism. Not crony capitalism, I'm not calling it that, not cronyism, because those things are far too wide of a description. When you hear people talk about crony capitalism, people hear capitalism and they get confused. Is that the free market? Is that enterprise? Why is that bad? Crony corporatism, what do I mean by that? I mean that in the same way that the institutions that were described earlier of the academy have been captured, that march is starting. And it's very subtle, but it's starting, and it's a bit different, but it's starting in the institutions of business, the means of production. So what do we do about that? Well, of course, the secret sauce to economic success, to entrepreneurship, to free enterprise, to markets, is making sure that people have the freedom to transact, the freedom to innovate, the freedom to think outside of the box and to build new things and to challenge old ideas with new ones, to challenge old products with new ones. And what has happened is where you have an accumulation and a concentration of capital, power, and wealth inside giant corporations, and there are noble exceptions to this, but some of those corporations have got into the business of putting other people out of business. That they don't innovate, they don't invent, they don't do anything new themselves. They capture the resources and the means to be able to attract capital, and then they use that, and have used that others have built, and they use that to capture regulators. So the partner of crony corporatism, the thing that it seeks, is what we call regulatory capture. That is the regulators, those that make the rules in government and set the rules that business must follow. So they could be tariffs for imports, they could be regulations on how information is exchanged, on the quality control of a product, on how something is manufactured, on a price that you must pay for something, on how something is taxed. And I can tell you that the system is rigged, and the system is rigged against the little guy. And if you rig the system against the little guy, all the future jobs, the future wealth generation, it's not going to come from the likes of AT&T or the likes even of Apple. It's not going to come from giant established companies. It's going to come from places, from companies that we haven't even heard of yet because they haven't even been established yet. And the problem with crony corporatism, with regulatory capture, is that now in some of these companies, so-called companies, you have leaders who are not entrepreneurial, I call them super managers, and who make it their business to crush innovation in the cradle, to stamp out new ideas and threats to their fiefdoms. They're like the feudal lords of old. They are given of old. They are given grants. They are given subsidies. They are given massive checks, what we call corporate welfare. And they are a drain on the economy, they're a drain on the taxpayer. They're not getting a few $1,000s. This isn't like some, social welfare, is challenged. The biggest welfare abuse in the developed world and in America is corporate welfare. They take the biggest checks. They've got their fangs stuck in your neck, and they are draining resources from the economy, resources that are needed to flow, to set up new businesses that some of you will need to go out and set up new businesses, new ideas, whatever it is that you may want to do. The lifeblood of free enterprise. They're draining it. And have a look at how much taxpayers' money is flowing to giant corporations who are hand in glove with government and who get government to give them subsidies and prop them up, and who lobby government to raise the barriers to entry to new entrants and new competition. And they do this in a number of ways. Campaign finance, checks all over the place, all parties, everybody. They hedge their bets. Have a look at the corporations that came out and spoke in favor of agitators like BLM and others, who write checks to them. Have a look at the leaders of the corporations that are funding some of the organizations that are so ardently opposed to everything that you stand for, and have a look at those leaders. And check something. See how many of them are entrepreneurs. How many of them are people that actually went out and took the risks to set up those businesses themselves, that had to beg, borrow, and scrape to build from scratch those businesses? And you'll find very, very few are led by entrepreneurs or founders. Entrepreneurs and founders build these businesses. They build great businesses. They have great ideas, and the super managers take over, capture that organization, capture the regulators, raise the barriers of protection and the barriers to entry against competitors. And crony corporatism is as un-American as you can get. It is against everything that this great, unprecedented nation has ever stood for. It's the enemy within. And the problem with crony corporatists is they talk like us, they kind of look like us, they don't go to the protest themselves. They speak the language of business. So when you hear a politician say, "I'm for business," set off an alarm. If they say, "I'm for the market, I'm for competition, I'm for free enterprise," that's healthy. If they're for big business, they're against you. They're against what you stand for. Therefore, a concentration of capital and the means of production into the hands of the few. And once you've done that, all these other guys we heard about earlier can control and influence them through protests and everything else. So that concentration of wealth that we are starting to see take place in America and elsewhere, be suspicious of it. Be a little bit suspicious of it. Rich guys aren't bad. Not necessarily, but they aren't good either. Okay? It's not, you have to ask how. How is this being done? Now, I have a book that I want to recommend to you all, and you really should try and get this. It's by Charles Koch. It's called Good Profit. Good Profit. It's a quick read. It's very enlightening. And what Good Profit does is it talks about, it doesn't call it quite crony corporatism, but it talks about the regulatory capture. If a company is coming to the government and saying, "I need a grant to do this thing," the answer should be, well, then you need to think again. You need to go back to the drawing board and come up with a better way. If a company is coming to government and saying, give me free resources, whether it's radio spectrum or water rights or whatever it may be, and they're saying, give me this for free, I need this for my business model, the answer needs to be, well, you need to go and fix your business model, because clearly it's broken. The reason that we are seeing lethargic growth, I mean, it surprises me when I think about when I was in my teens and in my 20s, you know, growth, good growth, you know, the Asian tigers and everything else, you know, 11%, 12% growth rates. Like, okay, yeah, that sounds about right. That's normal. Interest rates of 11% sounded normal. I remember having a conversation in London, I think it was in 1987, where a banker said to me, well, on interest, you should plan for the normal rate, the natural rate, to be somewhere between 8 and 11% on money. And now it's, I don't know, it's like 2 or 4 or whatever it is. Well, that's a warning sign. That's a warning sign, because now capital isn't flowing to where it's needed. In some places, we have negative interest rates, and they still can't lend out the money. Negative interest rates. They will pay you to take their money. They will pay you. It costs you, it doesn't cost you anything. They give you money to take it. Now, hands up in this room, who would take a loan if you got paid to take the loan? Hands up, all of you in this room who have got a negative interest rate loan. Interesting. So who's getting them? It's not you. It's not me. It's a handful of giant corporations who have captured the regulators and the rule book and have set the rules to a situation that is so ridiculous that there are negative interest rates available for those in a position and who have captured the regulators and the banking system sufficiently to get that deal. But no one in this room, everyone wants one, no one can get one. Now, of course, a negative interest rate loan is a ridiculous, immoral thing, I would argue. So it's good that you don't have one. But why is the capital rigged this way? Because we bail these guys out. Well, I say we. Governments bail these guys out with your money. And I say very deliberately with your money, and you may be sitting here and thinking, well, I'm 20 years old, I don't have any money, it doesn't matter. It's your money. It's your future taxes. It's the product of your labor, your innovation, and your ideas to the extent that you're allowed to even do those things anymore. That's what's being taxed. They are taxing your future to bail out today's crony corporatists for their mistakes. You look at what happened in Europe, and to a lesser extent here, with banking. Banks make loans. They made loans to some crony corporatist businesses. They made bad bets. They made loans to governments that were insolvent. And lo and behold, not surprisingly, those loans couldn't be repaid in many instances. In my own country, in Ireland, our banking system went underwater, was going underwater, because the banks had loaned to things that couldn't pay the money back. And so what happens is, normally, the way I was brought up, in a situation like that, is that you have this thing called bankruptcy, where the bank would go bankrupt and would go through a bankruptcy process, and you would have a purge, and the creditors would get whatever's left, and they would get some percentage of whatever was recovered from the loan book once it had gone into bankruptcy. Did we do that? No. No. Because the powers that be came along and said, well, you can't do that. You can't default on the bondholders of these banks. I mean, they provided money and they bought these banks' bonds in good faith. Well, yeah. They made a mistake. Well, that as may be, we have to pay them back in full. So I'll tell you what, we're going to take these private losses that these stupid banks incurred, and what we're going to do with those losses is we're going to nationalize them. And we're going to hand them to all of the taxpayers, and you are going to pick up the bill, and you are going to back this government writing a check for 100 cents in the dollar or euro, and we're going to pay these bondholders that didn't know what they were doing back 100 cents for their failed bet. Do you know how disgusting that is? And so in Ireland's case, we end up, if you look at the world debt map, we are proudly the second most indebted nation in the world per capita for having incurred the obligation to pay back money that we didn't borrow. So we now borrow to pay back the money that we didn't borrow. And you saw bailouts happen here. And today I have these discussions with my business colleagues. They say, oh, look what happened with Lehman. What happened with Lehman? Lehman went through bankruptcy. There was a workout, and actually the creditors did pretty well. They got a lot of their money back. That's exactly what needed to happen to the banking system. Detroit, we saved Detroit. No, actually, you probably killed Detroit. Because the reasons that Detroit was bankrupt was because it had bad practices. It was massively inefficient. It was captured by a system that meant that they were producing stuff that people didn't want to buy in sufficient quantity, and the costs of producing it were too high. And there was no innovation. Had Detroit not been bailed out, do you really think there would be no auto industry in Detroit? Of course there would. Because you would have had entrepreneurs in Detroit who knew the industry, and entrepreneurs from everywhere else come in and say, you know what, I can buy this plant. It's going to cost me 30 cents in the dollar. I can buy this equipment. I've got this new design for a car. I'm not going to be Elon Musk to ask the taxpayers to pay for everything that I'm doing. I'm going to actually go out and raise private capital. I'm going to raise private debt. I'm going to take my own risks, and I'm going to build a better product than what those guys are doing. But that's not what happened. Now, not to be too critical of Elon Musk, because I actually admire what he's doing, and I think going to Mars would be great. But I have developed this deep pessimism about the corporatists that chase the government for money rather than chase the consumer for money. I've made this point before, but if the answer is go to the government for the money, you're in the wrong business. You need to start again. So I want to emphasize to you, because it's really important that you guys get this. Because, I'm 49 now, people are my age, and I'm getting older and everything else. You guys have the passion, and you've got the time. I would implore you to start using the phrase crony corporatism to label what I've described to you. Because our enemies, not our enemies, but they love calling it capitalism. They love saying you're free market. This is not the free market. This is the arch enemy of the free market. Crony corporatism. Use the hashtag CRONY corporatism. And let's go after these people. Because they are standing on your windpipe. They are standing on the economy's windpipe. They and the people that prop them up need dependence. The more people that we can lift out of poverty, the better. But I talked to you about negative interest rates. This is like Soviet river engineering. You probably don't know this, but the Soviets absolutely destroyed parts of the river system in the Soviet Union. They even reversed the flow of one river. They drained a whole sea called the Aral Sea. It was drained. It wasn't their plan, but that's what happened as a consequence of what they did. And they turned whole vast areas, thousands of square miles, into barren desert. And that's what this misdirection of capital is doing. It is creating desert, economic desert. We are not seeing the new business, the rate of new businesses being created that we used to see years ago. Across the developed world, there are less new businesses being created now, and there are more businesses going out of business, small businesses, than has been the case in a very, very long time. And that's because these sources of the new crop, the new shoots of innovation, the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates, the next Elon Musk, they're not getting the resources anymore. They're not getting nurtured because this system that has concentrated capital and the means of production into the hands of the few is starving enterprise, entrepreneurship, and freedom of its vital energy, capital, the capital that we need to challenge the system. Because when you're an entrepreneur, that's what you're doing. You're challenging the system. The first entrepreneurial idea, or any entrepreneurial idea an entrepreneur has, generally is a rejection of something that already exists. It's to say, I can do this better than these guys can do. So in my own case, for example, it's in radio spectrum. I know that price discovery is essential on radio spectrum. So radio spectrum in this room is worth more right now than radio spectrum will be, or bandwidth in this room is worth more now than it will be at 4:15 tomorrow morning. And yet it's priced more or less the same. Well, why is that? That's called market failure. We should be able to have dynamic price discovery. So, not to get into the weeds on this, but this is something I know. Peter Thiel has written an excellent short book which you should add to Good Profit. And that book is called 0 to 1. Now, Peter Thiel is an investor in my business, I'm proud to say. He's a great guy. Read 0 to 1. It's not expensive. Read that actually before you read Good Profit, because one goes into the other very easily. But we need the Peter Thiels of this world, the Steve Jobs of this world, to have access to capital. And they're not getting it anymore, or certainly not to the degree that they used to be able to get it, because the barriers to entry are being raised, the barriers to innovation are being raised, the means to production are being controlled. If you look at how much regulation has been produced between 1947 or even more recently since the early 90s until now, regulation, the rules of how that tie down business. Now, you have to have regulators. I'm not suggesting that you can't have regulatory institutions. They are absolutely essential. But the role of a regulator is to be a referee. It is not to keep changing the rules of the game for the strongest team, because they're offering you a job after you retire, or they're funding your campaign, or they're funding your boss's campaign, or whatever it may be. If that's how the game is played, I don't know if any of you follow soccer, but Barcelona are going to be champions forever. If you get to the point where the referee will blow up the whistle when you score the next goal and you're one goal ahead, those guys are going to win all the time. And that's what's happening. They control the referees, they've bought them, or they're offering incentives. It's interesting around the world, the developed world, where you see how many people who are supposed to be the gamekeeper or the referee end up playing for the biggest team, sometimes within weeks of being a referee. 1 week referee, 2 weeks later, they're playing for the biggest team with the most money. We used to call it corruption. But, saying that that's not corruption is sort of arguing about how many angels there are on the head of a pin. This is perhaps the most deadly threat in some ways to freedom. And it's the most deadly threat because what it affects and what it chokes off is freedom's creation. What freedom gives you is the ability to participate in creation, in innovation, to always strive forward, to come up and implement brilliant ideas, brilliant products, brilliant services. If you interfere with the ecosystem of creation, you interfere with freedom because you interfere with what freedom produces. And if you can get rid of or choke off what freedom produces, you can convince people that too much freedom is a dangerous thing for them and that they must be able to trade it away for security. That's the argument here. It's been the argument. Franklin talked about it. Those that would give up a little freedom to obtain a little security deserve neither and will surely lose both, as the great man said. This is an attack on the product of freedom, of creation. And that's why you have to defend it vigorously, because if the little guy can't see that she or he has got a fair shot at participating in the fruit, in the harvest of freedom, then they're going to be very open to the lies of the other side. And the people who are cutting off the path to creation in freedom are those that have concentrated wealth and power in major corporations, who are raising the barriers to entry to innovation, who are trying to shape the world and the rules that regulate it to themselves, to keep their comfortable systems. They are the pigs in Animal Farm. So watch out for them. Be aware. Bring the message out. Shine a light on crony corporatism. Tell the truth about it. Look for it. It's blatant. It's easy to find. And interestingly, you will find that people that think they're on the other side end up being on the same side as us. I'll tell you a quick story before we go to questions. A few years ago, some of you will be old enough to remember it, when we, in the middle of the crisis, when everything was blowing up and melting down, and that should have been allowed to play itself out without bailouts. I've made that point. But there was a protest, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Many people who in there that look like Antifa people, they're Antifa people and all of that stuff. They I love that, by the way. They same sort of folks in some measure that you would see at the Occupy Wall Street protests. And they set up a big camp down in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan, not far from Wall Street. And it was kind of fun to watch. It was a bit of a sort of, because those things are cool, you've got to admit, they've got sometimes good music and they've got the arts on their side and everything else. One of the funny things I loved, because I was doing a lot of work with the NYPD at the time, was they had fishing rods and they would put donuts on the end of them and hold them out to the cops. Which was a joke between them and the cops. Anyway, I decided to go down there one day because I was listening to what they were saying about the injustice and abuses of Wall Street and what was going on. And it was interesting because they were almost right in what they were saying. They knew something really wrong was happening. So this morning, I put on the most outrageous pinstripe suit that I had in my wardrobe. And I walked down to Zuccotti Park, and I looked like the capitalist on the Monopoly board, yeah? Now, I didn't have the top hat because I couldn't find one. If I could have found one, I would have worn that too. And I went down there in my outrageous pinstripe suit, and immediately this group, and by the way, the NYPD was so worried, they had a couple of plainclothes detectives go down there with me, and they said, "You're crazy, you should do that." I said, "Let me do this." I went down, and a group gathered around, and slightly hostile, hoodies up, And someone said, you work on Wall Street? And I said, no, I don't actually physically work on Wall Street, but I know what you mean. I benefit from that system. I get investments from Wall Street, from good people on Wall Street, and there are some great people on Wall Street. And they said, well, this is outrageous. Wall Street's doing all of this stuff. We need to overturn the system, blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's interesting. I said, would you think about this? I said, they had losses, some of them, not all of them. I said, now, the worst performers on Wall Street have the biggest losses. So the government has come along and has bailed them out with all of our money and made good their losses, which rewards them and punishes the good guys on Wall Street who didn't have losses, who ran their businesses prudently, who took the right risks, but they're seeing their competitors get bailed out and be saved. So it's pretty unjust to them too. Maybe they should be down here as well. And I said, who's paying for this? Who's making this decision? I said, do you think it's the Wall Street guys that are making these decisions? Sure. The bad actors, the guys with the biggest losses, are lobbying the government and say, save us or the world will melt down. The world will never be the same again. What they really mean is, I'm going to lose my Gulfstream 650. I'm going to have to take United again. But they managed to change that and transfer that into being a problem for the world. Now it's a problem for you, buddy, because you made bad decisions. And a hand comes up, which wasn't normal in Zuccotti Park, because normally they would just shout at you. A hand comes up, and this guy says, I'm from Canada. I don't know if that's a good Canadian accent. Of course, he was polite, right? So he puts his hand up. And he says, are we protesting in the wrong place? I said, yes, you are. You need to protest the guys that make the rules and write the checks for these people, the regulators, the government that is bailing these people out. That's where the problem lies. It's the regulators and the capture of those regulators by the worst unhealthy performers in our economies who should already be out of business, who are only there because they're like some feudal lord of old, because their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather bashed someone over the head at some battle in 12-something, and this guy's sitting there, this corporation is sitting there, the equivalent of it, on some massive government grant, and is telling the government, you need to give me another $7 billion this year, otherwise you won't have rural whatever, or you won't have this, that, or the other. They scare the legislators get captured, the regulators get their orders from the legislators also get captured, a whole bunch of them want jobs with the biggest winning team, they'll blow the whistle when they're told or when they think their future employer wants the whistle to be blown, and the whole system stops working. That's crony corporatism. Get up, fight it, because if you fight that, you are attacking and putting your sights exactly where they need to be, on a very lethal source. The source that is trying to and is successfully cutting off the lifeblood of freedom, which is the harvest that freedom brings. Thank you.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Great. My name is Victor Santos. I'm from the University of Florida. I'm a marketing major, so in the fellow business industry. So my question for you is, what you pointed out today was very interesting to me because I haven't heard it being spoken of before, and I personally think it is the biggest threat to capitalism, and I think it is the biggest issue with capitalism. A lot of people that I talk to, especially, like the far left communists say that, this is late stage capitalism, this is bound to happen. No. So my question for you is, what can we do in the early onset of these startup businesses to prevent this from happening in the corporate world?
What we have to do is we have to unite against it, because as an onset, let's say that you decide you want to go out and set up a business. You're going to be struggling to pay the rent. You are going to be staying up at night wondering how you're going to make payroll. Because that's what everyone, these entrepreneurs that tell you it's not like that, they're BSing you. Every entrepreneur goes through that. So you're going to have those immediate short-term concerns to have to address. And so what we have to do is we have to evangelize. We have to, it's in our joint interest to shed a light on this. So what you should do today at some point is get on Twitter or Facebook, and Twitter frankly is better because the crusty old regulators, they tend to be more on Twitter than they are on Facebook. But get onto social media and start talking about crony corporatism. Hashtag crony corporatism. Because they're really nervous about this. And as soon as crony corporatism starts to be talked about, Charles Koch's talking about it in his book. That guy employs 120,000 people in America. He's talking about it. If you start talking about it, your voice can be as powerful as Charles Koch's. You're a young guy. You got time. Start talking about it, draw attention to it, and as long as we're all talking about it and we're all pointing to the enemy that's trying to hide in our own ranks, we do that, we're purging the false Marxist narrative that this is late-stage capitalism. No, it's not. It's just some corrupt guys. We deal with those. We have courts and everything else. Let's fix our regulatory system, and the way to do that is through advocacy. So before you set up your business, or while you're setting up your business, start talking about crony corporatism. Do it today.
Okay, thank you. Also, I want to hand you my business card.
You bet. Transaction. There you go. He got in first. Next. Sorry, this side.
Thank you for speaking. I'm Pat Sorrells from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. I just wanted to ask you do you think that legislation in the House would be a good idea to deregulate the markets? And if so, what specific pieces of legislation would you suggest the Republicans focus on?
The big answer is yes. Yeah? I think that there are a number of things that need to be fixed, though, because these are all joined up problems, right? This is a metastasized problem. So, campaign finance reform, absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. Because these guys send checks everywhere. And they try and compromise. Now, a lot of people, thank God, aren't compromised by it, but they try. Campaign finance reform is really, really important. And I've heard this talked about before, and I talked about this in Europe years ago, but I would love to see a proposal that says for any new regulation passed, 2 existing pieces of regulation must be identified to be extinguished for 1 new piece to be passed. And then what I call biodegradable regulation, that when we pass regulations, that we say, this is why this regulation is being made, this is its purpose, and this is how we will measure whether it has succeeded or failed in 8 years from now, or in 10 years from now, or whatever it may be. And it comes up to be voted on again. And if it isn't, when it comes up to be voted on again or looked at again, people will look at, well, okay, this was what was the measure of success. Did it achieve that or not? No, it didn't. We won't even vote on it. It's gone. So you attach, if we start changing the way we regulate so that we support excellence in regulation, and we do that by basically putting a natural death fuse on every regulation so that we measure whether or not it's been successful, I think that would be a brilliant new approach to regulating and ensuring that only the good continues.
Thank you.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for repeatedly bringing up Charles Koch and the Koch brothers. I am a huge fan, and for people who don't read a lot of books, they have great interviews that you can watch, and the left's defamation campaign is one of the worst.
Oh, they
that's
hate
been
them.
going on.
They hate them so much. You know, Koch says, Koch makes a very interesting observation. He says that in hiring, what they do, and it works for them. He and his brother, if you put them together, they're the wealthiest guy in the world, the two of them, yeah? They value virtue above talent. So they want talent, and they recognize it, and they seek it out, but they will never trade virtue for it. They hire for virtue first. People with the right values. That book, Good Prophet, talks about it. Sorry, your question.
So my main question is, there's a streak in conservatism in the Republican Party right now, people that are espoused free marketers that are supporting tariffs. And I want your opinion on how we can try to convince people in our own movement that tariffs are a big government and crony corporatist tool that is used to benefit large corporations.
So I understand the instinct towards tariffs because the president's argument, or not the president's argument, but some of those that have been advising him's argument is these other guys cheat. China, the businesses that you're competing with in China are actually the government. And they bring all the resources of the government behind those businesses, so you're not really competing on a fair playing field. So that's it. It's not that the influence is I can understand where they're coming from, but the answer that their answer that tariffs are the right response is incorrect, and it's incorrect if you go to Hayek or you go to Schumpeter or any of these economists in the past, and I suspect some of these economists are not as well known as they need to be. If somebody's making a mistake and subsidizing something so that they're effectively subsidizing the cost of something that's coming into your economy that you need, and you're getting that thing cheap from somebody else's economy because they're making the mistake, take it while you can. Use it. And I think that's not understood. Tariffs are something that's populist. People can be, let's stop bringing that stuff in from wherever. Adam Smith talked about this.
In Bastia.
Adam Smith turns out to be completely prophetic. When you see his ideas post-1947 really getting a chance to live and breathe. It's really worrying that trade globally we haven't had a trade deal since the Uruguay round in 1990, something before some of you were born. Globalism can mean giant regulatory capture. The global economy, free trade, means a world of free peoples freely interacting with each other and freely trading with each other, lifting billions out of poverty, eliminating the causes of so much trouble, a war, famine, injustice in this world. If you are a country like Venezuela that thinks you can pump wealth out of the ground instead of harvesting the fruits of the product of your peoples and of freedom, we see where that ends up. So, free trade, please, guys, keep the flag of free trade flying, because it's essential to freedom, not just for our freedom, not just for the freedom of people in America or people in Europe, but freedom for people everywhere. If we don't have free trade, we condemn millions to enslavement.
Hello there. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Saurabh Sharma from the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm principally concerned with issues of moral governance, and so I'm going to betray my own ignorance in terms of understanding finance and financial products. Instinctively, I sometimes have a tendency to look at some of the complex financial products that are part of the transactions that make up to a third of our economy, and I have an instinctive reaction against them, that it's somehow a betrayal of capitalism, and that the way capital is manipulated in Wall Street is somehow immoral. And it is a product of my own ignorance, but I wonder if you could speak to that, to the instinct people feel against complex financial products.
I think if Wall Street, and particularly the best performers on Wall Street, would completely agree with what you've just said. So some of them find themselves in a situation where they're having to use this, financial alchemy, because the regulations are so restrictive that they can't actually take the risks and do the things that they would want to do that they otherwise would be doing. I mean, if you look at what has happened to community banking in America, it's a good example. Community banking is disappearing in America. And all of the big banks have bought all of these little guys and soaked them up. And now when you go into for a loan in Podunk, wherever, the decision on making that loan to you of a few $100 to start up your little thing, whatever it might be, is not being made in Podunk anymore. It's been made somewhere thousands of miles away. And we've lost that. We've lost touch with community and with the common sense. The thing about what they used to call church steeple lending. I remember a guy from Finland saying this to me. He said, we used to have a thing called church steeple lending, that a small bank would lend to people that it could see from the top of the church steeple in their town, because they knew everything about them. They didn't need data banks or credit histories. They knew who was reliable, who wasn't, so on and so forth, and they took their risks. Community banking and the loss of community banking has been catastrophic for the economy. And what's happened is with this massive, overwhelming set of regulations of who you can and can't lend to and what kind of risks you can take and everything else, it's taken the common sense out of the business. And when you regulate against common sense, then people start to design mechanisms to exploit the opportunities provided within that regulation, which is what you're identifying. It's the Soviet river engineering system.
Thank you, that helps a lot.
Thank you. So I have one question for you. Are there any Notre Damers in this room?